Summer is here. At Orderly Meds, we know this time is a reminder that life is full of new beginnings. Whether you're celebrating the nice weather, starting a new chapter, planning a vacation, or simply looking ahead to what's next, this season can be the perfect time to invest in yourself and your health. If you've struggled with weight loss and are curious about GLP-1 medications, Orderly Meds can help you learn about your options. Through a simple virtual process, you can connect with licensed medical professionals who can determine whether treatment may be appropriate for you. Getting started is fast, convenient, and happens online from the comfort of home. This summer, consider a new approach to feeling your best. Visit orderlymeds.com/podcast to learn more. That's orderlymeds.com/podcast. orderlymeds.com/podcast. Because every new season is an opportunity to take the next step forward. Compounded medications are not FDA approved. Eligibility required and determined by a licensed provider. Individual results may vary. See website for details.
History as It Happens, July 10th, 2026. Roger Griffin, From Fascism to Trumpism.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions.
I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within.
That is right out of Nazi Germany. That is not constitutional.
For a lot of people, calling Donald Trump a fascist was just ad hominem, a lazy political insult. It was the liberal who cried wolf.
He talks about the blood of America as being poisoned, echoing the same exact language used in Nazi Germany.
Die zu allen Zeiten nicht die Mehrheit, sondern die Minderheit ausgemacht haben.
There's an ism for almost everything, but in the current discourse, are isms clarifying or confusing us as Americans try to make sense of Donald Trump's destructive politics and his corrosive effect on democracy, the law, norms, basic human decency. That's next with Roger Griffin, one of the world's foremost experts on fascism, who says fascism is really not our problem today, as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Carl Gustav Jung said that today all our gods rhyme with ism. In other words, in a secular society, all that energy that used to feed religious cultures has been diverted like petrodollars floating around, investing themselves into individuals, either out of horror of what they are or out of misplaced adoration. There is something deeply ideological about Trump, which is he locates himself existentially and historically within a particular version of American history, and that American history has got a very strong ideology in the constitutional myth.
Communism's easy to sell. I would be the greatest communist in history. I'd be right up there with Lenin.
So as I've been paying attention to President Trump recently, as his job approval rating dips even lower, amid more reports revealing his staggering corruption, and as he's fumbled everything from the war in Iran to something as seemingly inconsequential as fixing the reflecting pool here in Washington. As I watch and listen to him, I've thought about all the time and energy and oceans of ink and podcasts consumed by the fascism debate.
So I had one of Hitler's speeches translated into English, and I think this tells us a lot about where Donald Trump is getting.
Here we are, 11 years since Donald Trump entered politics, and are we any closer to defining his politics accurately than we were a decade ago? You know, I gotta say, watching him recently, I don't see a fascist or even a fascist movement around him.
So yesterday we had 111 missiles shot by the Islamic Republic of Japan.
Trump is still a right-wing demagogue, a phony populist who pretends to care for the working class by tapping into their imaginary fears.
It's the enemy from within, all the scum that we have to deal with that hate our country. That's a bigger enemy than China.
But you know, way back in September 2016, and that was just a couple of months before Trump defeated Hillary Clinton, historian Roger Griffin wrote an essay about the Trump phenomenon. Griffin said, despite the frequent stigmatizing of Trump by his critics as a fascist, it would be refreshing if more journalists used political categories with greater nicety. Trump is a populist, or to be exact, a radical right-wing populist, Griffin said. He owes his power to voicing in hardly sophisticated rhetoric widespread prejudices and simplistic diagnoses to complex problems which, if translated into practice, would prove counterproductive, discriminatory, and inhuman in many areas, both domestically and on the international stage. Griffin went on to say, to be a fascist, Trump would, like Mussolini and Hitler, have to set about seizing power democratically so as to be able to dismantle or pervert the institutions of liberal democracy entirely. Trump, whatever his faults, has given no sign that he intends the destruction of the U.S. constitutional system and its replacement by a totalitarian new order with himself as its charismatic leader for, in his case, a short perpetuity. Again, that was written by Roger Griffin in 2016, and for the most part, it holds up pretty well, despite everything, even January 6.
Who hides evidence? Criminals hide evidence, not honest people.
When Trump incited a riot to attack Congress, a very fascist thing to do. Trump and his administration full of anti-government fanatics, charlatans, and grifters are doing severe damage to American democracy, the rule of law, and civil liberties. But he is not trying to overturn democracy. He is not a revolutionary. He's there to make money while inspiring fear in his opponents, and he has done a good job of that. Well, maybe you think that's fascism anyway, or close enough. Roger Griffin, historian and professor emeritus at Oxford Brookes University, has studied and written about these matters for decades. He became a historian of fascism in a most unexpected way and defined this political ideology in a way that has influenced generations of scholars. Roger Griffin, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
We're going to dive into your history as a historian and how you came to this subject, a lifelong study of fascism and other isms and history, political science. We'll get to all of that in a little bit. I just want to talk to you about what's happening right now, because you've been coming on my show for 4 or 5 years now. And for the past decade in this country and really across the world, people have been trying to figure out what is Trumpism. It's really not an ideology. And given recent reports about Trump's staggering corruption, self-enrichment, self-dealing, the incontestable fact that the man really doesn't have any core values except himself, that maybe there really is no ism here.
Well, of course, any famous person can create an ism. Carl Gustav Jung said that today all our gods rhyme with ism. In other words, in a secular society, all that energy that used to feed religious cultures has been diverted like petrodollars floating around, investing themselves into individuals, either out of horror of what they are or out of misplaced adoration. I think you're absolutely right to suggest that there is a particular hollowness in the idea of Trumpism as an ideology. However, I think if you dig a bit deeper, if you move from ideology to the word myth, and then you look at some major figures in the 20th century, I mean, Marxism is seen as an ideology because it had an awful lot of theory behind it because of a guy called Karl Marx. And a lot of his followers, like Gramsci or whatever, they're definitely intellectuals trying to use intellectual tools to shape a worldview and shape policy, etc. But there are some very interesting forms of vision, political vision, which generate a lot of words. They generate a lot of thoughts. The point at which they actually can be dignified with the word ism is another matter. But in a way, I think if you were, say, a Chinese or Japanese sort of political scientist looking at Trumpism from a safe distance and another culture, you could say, well, look, there is something deeply ideological about Trump, which is he locates himself existentially and historically, and he did spectacularly with an extraordinary display of egomania on the 4th of July, within a particular version of American history. And that American history has got a very strong ideology in the constitutional myth. What's called the foundation myth of America is very, very strong, and it's got very strong ideological components. You know, the French Revolution, the French Enlightenment. It wasn't yet the French Revolution, but major Enlightenment thinkers like Paine and Montesquieu and these people informed a vision of liberal democracy, the rights of the people, and that is ideological. And it's no coincidence that we call Trump a populist. So I would be careful.
He taps into that. He taps into American history, even though he's ignorant of American history.
If you see it comparatively, if you talk about, Xi Jinping's vision of China or whatever. I think by the time you've become a president, you are a carrier of ideas which are taken for granted. If you take contemporary China, I mean, there's very little communism left, but nevertheless, you couldn't possibly make sense of who he is and what the Chinese leadership is doing now without going back to the Chinese Revolution and Mao, etc. So I think what you're dealing with politicians anyway is very often a hollowing out of what was originally fairly substantial in terms of rationalization. It's just that Trump takes so much of the American tradition and blatantly mythifies it. And the reason we can see that so clearly is because of his intellectual ineptitude in handling language and concepts. But in a funny sort of way, I don't think he's much more hollow than an awful lot of American presidents in the 20th century, if you talk about their reasons for going to Vietnam.
Yeah, well, you know what? One reason why it's hard to discern an ideology with Trump, for the reasons I already mentioned, you know, he doesn't stick to a position for more than 45 seconds, etc., is that there's so much chaos. And I was thinking of Nazism before connecting with you. There was plenty of chaos and corruption and inefficiency in the Nazi regime, which we often think of as ideology in power. Hitler himself was obsessed with ideological concepts of race and war and social Darwinism, right? But he was surrounded by a whole bunch of thugs and grifters, too. Goering basically stole every piece of art in Europe. So I guess these things can coexist within an ideological system. You can have self-dealing, corrupt, inefficient, rival bureaucrats. I mean, that's something that Hitler fomented in Nazi Germany. He had people at each other's throats competing with each other to win his favor.
When we talk about political theory and political commentary, etc., we have to have a sort of sliding scale that goes from sort of absolutely irrational, blatantly psychotic myths right the way through to a high level of rationalization. And just to take one example, the idea of white supremacy can be massively rationalized, and it was, with pseudo-biology and pseudo-anthropology and a whole load of pseudo-history, etc., but it was taken very seriously. It became an ideology. If you look at the eugenics movement, etc., you see a high level of scientization as well. But ultimately, the idea of white supremacy is a completely hollow myth with no scientific basis whatsoever. So when we talk about Trumpism, etc., we have to accept the idea that ideas themselves manifest themselves in a whole range of different levels of substantiality and articulateness. But at the end of the day, probably all ideologies are rationalizations of very deep-lying mythic constructs.
We've talked about what's happening across the world several times on this podcast, not just what's happening in the United States with Trump. Alex Duvall, who's a scholar at Tufts University here in the U.S., uses a term called the political marketplace, which is now the dominant dynamic in international relations. He calls it global mafia politics. Human rights, democracy, freedom, liberty do not matter. It's all about the deal. So countries on the periphery of world power are sliced, diced, ranked, and traded. And Trump is a practitioner of global mafia politics. Just look at Venezuela.
Well, I'm reminded of Brecht. One of Brecht's greatest plays was The Resistible Rise, not Irresistible, The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, which is a parody of the rise to power of Hitler, where Hitler is portrayed as the head of a gangster syndicate in Chicago, which wants to take over the vegetable market. And it's a complete parody of the rise of Hitler. And to see Hitler as ultimately a sort of capitalist gangster trying to take over power. I mean, it's brilliant. And there's an element of that if you look at the history of Soviet Union and you look at the tension between Trotsky and Stalin. I mean, you can see mafia elements in all power politics. As for a place like North Korea, it's quite extraordinary. But again, it's complicated, isn't it? Because if you go back through history or look at the history of the Roman Empire, etc., there are a few phases when the Roman Empire or the Roman politics seemed to ennoble itself with certain ideas. There was a period in the Roman Republic which also used the concept of the people, etc. And of course, it was using the concept of the people in a slave society where ideas and debate, etc., seemed to be taken seriously, but there is an argument for the idea, and I think there's a feminist line here as well, that in the whole history of patriarchal power, ultimately there's a huge amount of rationalization and power play going on under the screen of villas and banquets and ballrooms and big sculpture, to glorify something which is we talk about naked power. I mean, there's a lovely line from Bob Dylan that even the president of the United States sometimes has to stand naked. Trump manifests something which is probably an integral part. Look at the history of the papacy. Look at the history of the Borgias in the Middle Age, in the Renaissance. I just think there's probably always been a tussle between virtuous idealists and the most horrifically criminal, pathological people, all playing social games to dress up their power as legitimate.
Tap subscribe now in the show notes to skip ads, get early access, and enjoy all of our bonus content. Or go to historyasithappens.com.
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace.
Last year, I went through many different life changes. I needed to take a pause and examine how I was feeling in the inside to better show up for the ones who need me to be my best version of myself.
When you're navigating life's changes, Talkspace can help. Talkspace is the #1 rated online therapy, bringing you professional support from licensed therapists and psychiatry providers that you can access anytime, anywhere.
Living a busy life, navigating a long-distance relationship, becoming a first-step father, Talkspace made all of those journeys possible. I could speak with my therapist in the office. I could speak with my therapist in the comfort of my home. I was never alone.
Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance, no problem. Now get $80 off your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
You've been studying fascism your whole professional life. Let's start from the very beginning, shall we?
Well,
you were born in post-war United Kingdom. You could still see the damage from the war that fascist Germany waged against your country. I guess if somebody ran into you as a child, they probably wouldn't have guessed you'd become a well-regarded and highly cited professor on the subject.
I'm 78 now, and I've reached a point where you sort of look back and you think, well, actually, this has been a very weird life. And it's especially weird when I meet eminent historians or political scientists who, when I look at their trajectory to being who they are, most of them seem to have actually studied what they've become an expert in. And a lot of them come from academic families, or they had a father or a relative or something that initiated them to what they eventually got really good at. But my trajectory seems to have been extremely weird when I think about it, because I was in the coldest winter on record in Britain since the last ice age, 1947, 1948. And I won't take out the violin, but my mum's circumstances, she was effectively a war widow, and her circumstances were deep impoverishment. She herself had left school at 15 and had diphtheria, and there's a whole tragic thing there. But she was born into a post-war Britain, which was fantastic. Well, the rationing continued to the early 1950s for some products. So there was nothing really in my background there. And it was actually... Talk about sliding door moments. I went to a very ordinary, what's called a primary school in England. This was a suburbia of London called Harrow. If you know anything about the history of fascism, Oswald Mosley was MP for Harrow. If you know anything about upper class education, a lot of prime ministers went to either Eton or Harrow School. So it's famous for that. That's all on the hill. I was not on the hill. I was down in the depths of ordinary Harrow. But my school, which was a very ordinary school, I had never heard of this guy, but there was a guy called John Lyon who was a farmer in the 16th century, and he made a lot of money. And he founded Harrow School after the dissolution of the monasteries, which meant that there was a great need for public education, which is why they're called public schools now, even though they're private schools. And he'd set up a foundation for a few poor kids at the time to go to a day school. And that had, by the time I came into the world, and I was 11 years old in the 50s, meant that there was an exam that you could take as an entrance exam. Now, I think I'm old enough to reveal this embarrassing fact. my benchmate took the exam on the Tuesday and I took the exam on the Thursday, and he told me what the English essay question was, and it was my mum who wrote the English essay, and I learnt it by heart. And I got into this plush school on my mum's English, and then for years had a total imposter syndrome, which meant that I thought I knew I was surrounded by very rich kids, but I also made the great error of assuming that rich kids were bright kids. So I thought at some point I'd be exposed as a fraud.
So your mom did your homework.
Into this habit of doing loads of homework.
Sure, but your mom did your homework to help you there.
No. Well, I actually very quickly got disillusioned with my mum and homework because I let her do a French test and she was rubbish. And from then on, I did it all myself. And I got into this sort of nerdy habit because there was a perfect feedback system. If I did good homework, my mum was happy, the school was happy, and I was sort of happy in a nerdy sort of way. And I didn't have friends and things because it was a very socially oriented school. And I didn't really realize till much later that nobody ever invited me to their house. It was probably I was sort of one of these horrible swatty kids. But what that did was create a massive, and this was, of course, long before social media or computers, etc. I got into the habit of reading. I just loved reading. And it was primitive days of TV as well. And my mum loved literature and loved classical music. Strangely enough, I grew up in a sort of hothouse of literature and music, even though we were in a poor little house. One thing I would give my public school credit for was that I was taught languages well enough to apply for Oxford University, and I got a scholarship to Oxford. So that sliding door moment of my mum's essay created an even deeper imposter syndrome. I no longer thought about that essay, but I really did not sociologically identify with Oxford at all.
So you got into Oxford based on your strength in languages.
Yes, I did French and German literature.
How many languages do you read today?
French and German. Italian is fairly good at. My wife's Italian, so that's down to her mum. And I can read other Latin languages. I've recently got a post in a Slovak university called Mate Bell. And I must say, learning another language at this age is really quite scary. But but I loved languages. And I think I wasn't to quit for Oxford social life, rowing and parties and all that sort of, all the stuff that Oxford's associated with. And I ended up almost by default doing lots and lots of work on what I loved. And I loved French and German literature. Sure. But I also loved relating literature to isms. And we're back to isms here. I mean, I found Voltaire fascinating because he was meant to embody this thing called the Enlightenment and the ideas of a better society and the debt of the French Revolution. And it's very quickly I had this sense that when I was studying a literary person in either France or Germany, they were like a mirror of or a prism for looking at what was going on in society in Europe and in that country at the time. So by default, I was doing a sort of intellectual history by studying literature.
You know, when politicians write an autobiography, to be careful about their origin stories. You know, people write myths about themselves, but human memory is notoriously unreliable. And I think about how I got to where I am today. I decided at some point, because of something that happened, maybe I started watching a lot of sports, that I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. I had that one moment that stands in my memory, right? An epiphany. I don't know. Truth is mediated over time, but whatever. I think of myself as a kid, and at some point I decided this is what I want to do. You had a similar kind of experience, right? You visited the Goethe house in Weimar.
Yeah, this was...
On the same day you visited...
Yeah, well, this is another sliding door moment. Because I was this nerdy linguist, I ended up getting a good first from Oxford University. I never thought I could. I mean, it's a mythic thing, a first from Oxford. Anyway, that's another story. But I mean, basically, I overestimated how much my colleagues were working because fellow students were doing very little work. But there I was studying away and taking seriously all my assignments. I found out later only what we call mugs in English actually take their assignments and their reading list seriously. But yeah, I won money to go to study German in Germany, and I chose a course in a place called Göttingen, where there was a big army base just after the war. But part of the course was a trip to East Germany. Now, East Germany at the time, this was the Cold War. And I mean, for me, East Germany was like Mars, I mean, in the West, we had no real idea in England. There was this long before documentaries and good communications, and obviously long before any sort of electronic communication with the world and all that. And I wanted to see what had happened to Eastern Germany, because this huge area, which included most of Berlin and places like Leipzig and Dresden and all these places, they were in Germany say drüben, they were over there. So I ended up, part of the program, going to Weimar. Now, Weimar was associated with Goethe. Goethe's the German Shakespeare. And I went religiously to his pilgrimage house, where I saw the study on which Goethe wrote some of his greatest poetry, etc. And in the afternoon, we were bussed out. And this was a Soviet hotel. I mean, it was big red star in front of it. And we were bussed out to, coincidentally, a place where there was the site of Goethe's favorite oak tree. But shatteringly, I realized that oak tree was actually inside Buchenwald concentration camp. By the way, Buchenwald means beech forest. How about that for a linguistically misleading concept? And the prisoners were actually tortured on Goethe's oak tree. I remember going round the museum, which incidentally didn't mention Jews. It was only communists that were killed, according to the Soviets. And I came away from there with a very weird sense of disconnect. Something had been lit inside me, which was going to nag at me, because I couldn't reconcile the Germany I was loving through its language and literature and culture and what the Germans had done, or Nazis had done, in the Second World War. And that, I think, became a sort of, not like a time bomb, but it was like a latent fascination, almost morbid fascination. Don't forget, I'd been born just after the war. My uncle had been in the war repairing bombers that were coming back to base. He was very young, he became an engineer, etc. So the war was very close in a way. And also, I still remembered the extraordinary impact of the revelation of Belsen, which was reported on by a guy called David Dimbleby on the BBC. And that had created a huge shockwave through British culture when we found out how justified the war was morally. So that was a big moment, going to Buchenwald and trying to make sense of the relationship between culture and Nazi concentration camp system.
But at this point, you're still not decided on, I'm going to become an expert on fascism.
No, actually, I wanted to be a Germanist. And I did have misgivings. I did reach this point, which was quite anarchic, where I said, actually, if you really love literature, you shouldn't teach it, you should write it. And I did have some abortive attempts at writing. But I didn't really have I didn't have a father figure. I didn't have any sort of vocational. I didn't realize that a lot of people go to Oxford to get a first to go into finance. I had no idea. I was very naive. An awful lot of politicians and businessmen in Britain have been to Oxbridge and got a degree and gone straight into making as much money as possible. I was one of these rare people who actually sort of enjoyed what I was doing. So I started a doctorate. I got nowhere. It was an abortive doctorate partly because I was sort of lost at that time in my sense of direction. My
let me ask you, though,
died very early, you see.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that about your mother. I was just going to ask you about another step in your intellectual development toward becoming a historian of fascism and isms and political movements, really. The first country that became a fascist country was Italy. And you were introduced to a book by Julius Evola.
Yeah, well, this is another sliding door, meeting my future wife.
The book, La Rivolta contro il mondo moderno, The Revolt Against the Modern World. Go ahead, Roger.
Yeah. I was in a taverna in a very beautiful part of Genoa. Well, I was on my own having a meal, and this guy who recognized my foreign accent, he tried to convert me to this book, which he said had all the answers to all the problems of the world. And so, being a bit naive and not having very good Italian, I took a note of the title and went back to Oxford. At the time, again, naively, I thought Oxford, the Bodleian Library, had all the books in the world. Oxford hadn't heard of this guy, so I thought, oh, this is weird. And I suppose I had a sense this was going to lead me. I can retro justify it, but I got the book, read it, and suddenly I had this extraordinary experience that, I suddenly saw what fascism was about for fascists. And it was about this extraordinary cycle in history between a national greatness, a decay of a nation, and a rebirth of national greatness. It's absolutely mapped out in this book. It's the revolt against the modern world as it is. Liberalism, democracy, pluralism, equality, all these, female emancipation, vulgarity of consumerism, etc. Written in 1936. Evola went on to become a major inspiration for black terrorism in the 1970s in Italy, and a major figure, but nobody knew about him. In fact, my first article ever written was on this guy. So that was another bit of the jigsaw, that I got interested in ideas, and I'd met this guy who saw, and he was very articulate, and he wasn't a fanatical racist. He didn't come across as such, but here was belief, and that experience of belief probably made a subliminal link with what I'd seen in Buchenwald, that they were destroying something they believed needed to be destroyed to make the world live again. I thought, wow.
They're not psychopaths.
Well, it's so complicated, isn't it? I mean, real psychopaths have a sort of some real malfunction somewhere that makes them psychopaths. But if you like, you can have a perfectly intelligent, normal, truth-seeking, vision-seeking individual who can't stand. That's why I use Taxi Driver as a great film. He comes up from Vietnam. He's not a psychopath as such, but he ends up killing the pimps, Jodie Foster's pimps, because he has this sudden vision of his mission is to clean up New York. He sacrifices himself to this idea of a mission. And suddenly it was all coming together. And then this extraordinary event happened, which by this time I'd given up my doctorate, I needed a job. And I was offered a job in teaching isms. I mean, how amazing. At Oxford Polytechnic, which was not a university yet, became Oxford Brookes University. There was a fiercely anti-communist head of department, a lovely guy. Okay, I'll say his name was Mowat, and he was.
Sorry, no one listening will know who that is. But you haven't done your PhD yet, right?
No, this was after I'd aborted my German PhD.
Yeah, so you haven't done the.
No, I was still a lost soul trying to catch up with my weird Oxford battered self. But the history department had just employed a Marxist, and he was so anti-Marxist and so frightened he felt he needed a counterbalance to Marxism. And he met me at a party and heard I got a first and loved literature and art and stuff. And he basically fixed a job for it, could never do it now. So again, in a total freak moment, I got a job without an interview at Oxford Polytechnic. And I've never had an interview for a job in my life. Well, I have for my recent one.
And you were hired to teach the other side of this debate over...
Well, that was the subtext. I was just given free range to teach history from a non-Marxist perspective. And at the time, that wasn't difficult because I was too indoctrinated by my own background to even be close to being a Marxist. I was a sort of what would now be called woke.
But you had studied languages, not history.
Yeah, I know. But I was, my secret guru was Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell, and I only survived psychologically at Oxford by being deep into Californian counterculture and the Doors and all sorts of stuff going on. I was teaching history of ideas, which was really getting me into things like liberalism and socialism, et cetera, et cetera. And then along comes a new head of department, and this guy was pivotal. And I looked him up, and he doesn't exist. And it shows how misleading it would be to allow Wikipedia or whatever to dictate who has been important. Because this guy, Robert Murray, he'd fought, American guy, he'd fought fascism from Sicily up through the peninsula. After the war, he'd survived that. He went to university in America. I don't even know where he went, but he wanted to know what he'd been fighting. When he met me and knew I was now married to an Italian, he said, "Can you teach a course on fascism with me?" Suddenly, my life fell into place because I was now reading theories of fascism. Some shape was dawning in my mind, and I started trying to find other theorists who'd recognize this pattern of decadence and rebirth, or what I was going to call palingenesis. And nobody had. I mean, I couldn't find it. I had bits of it in a few, and I could list the names, and that's irrelevant. But basically, nobody had actually synthesized it into a sort of neat theory. And suddenly I thought, well, I'd blown the doctorate before at Oxford, but why don't I go back to Oxford part-time and write a doctorate on this new theory of fascism?
So what was the state of fascist studies at this point, the history of fascism? Because you're kind of coming to it randomly almost, right? You have
no background in
languages, you're hired to
history.
teach history, and then
Yeah.
you meet this fellow who says, why don't we teach a course on fascism? What was
Well,
the
I
state
would-
of fascism
I would-
studies?
Well, that was the beauty in a way. I mean, if I was on the right sort of psychotic drugs, I'd probably think I had some sort of destiny. But I mean, that is nonsense, of course. But it was extremely neat. For example, if I'd very quickly found somebody with my theory, that would have been the end of my career as a political scientist. What I found was several major experts who had bits of what I call my theory now. It was never my theory. I mean, we're all on the backs of giants, etc. But George Mosser had taken fascist ideas seriously. He was this refugee from Nazi Germany and spoke German, and he moved from medieval studies to fascist studies. And he had seen a lot of this stuff, but he hadn't synthesized it into a theory. There was a guy called Stanley Payne, had got almost fully complete a theory of fascism as something not reactionary and not nihilistic, but actually having a sort of, I feel like, an ideology. And I could give you a list of names. But generally speaking, if you had, and I could document this, if you ran a conference in Reading, as a guy called Stuart Wolf did twice, of international experts on fascism, put them all together in a conference, the papers are all over the place. There's absolutely no consensus. Is Latin American dictatorship fascist? Is Stalinism fascist? A complete breakdown of any sort of scholarly consensus. So it was into this perfect Babel type smattering and spreading of theories.
Tower of Babel.
Scattering, that's the word, the scattering of theories that I came in, and I did develop quite a missionary zeal. And I ended up with this theory, which, very interestingly, I was examined in a college at Oxford called St. Anthony's, which was run by a guy called Ralph Darendorf, very famous. He wanted to fail me. He was the internal examiner. So another sliding door moment was I'd written to now extremely eminent Sir Ian Kershaw, one of the most famous British historians, certainly the best biographer of Hitler you'll ever come across. Yes. I'd written to him, and this was long before emails, when I felt very lonely with my theory. And I got this letter back about 3 months later, which said, I think you're onto something. So when I was asked, who'd you like to be the external examiner, I invited him. And he defended me against my internal. It's meant to be the other way around. And I got my doctorate from Oxford.
So what year was this?
1991. And there the story would have ended, except that I invited myself to a conference on fascism in Lancaster, and it was being basically presided over by this guy called Roger Eatwell. And I literally buttonholed him, well, not literally, after the conference and said, I've got this theory, I've just done this doctorate, and I'd really like, and I mean, please, if you're ever in this position, just give somebody with a bit of enthusiasm, a bit of hope. I don't think he thought I was going to make anything of it, but he was editing a series on the nature of the right. And suddenly I get this, still didn't have emails. I actually got a letter. Would you like to turn your doctorate into a book? And then I can actually literally say now the rest is history. That was the nature of fascism, which nearly got remaindered, except that a hard copy version of it was in the case of a reader for a publishing firm called Routledge. When her car broke down on the way to a conference, she was sitting in a garage waiting for her car to be fixed. She fished the hard copy of my Nature of Fascism out of her bag and started reading it. And the next thing I know, I get a letter, 1993, saying, I think we'd like to turn your Nature of Fascism into a paperback. Wow. And so, that was it.
Well, let's go back here. Let's roll the clock back again. So you got this opportunity to study fascism. You develop this theory of fascism that you had a very hostile examiner who didn't believe it was worth studying. I was asking you before about what was the nature or the status of fascism studies. Here we are, in the 1980s, a generation or more after this political phenomenon had lit the world on fire and started a war that killed some 50 million people. Your approach was different. You actually read, because of your skill in languages, you read the writings of fascists to figure out what they believed in, whereas prior historians hadn't been doing that.
Well, I find this really fascinating. You see, if you actually look up at political science definition of feminism or anarchism or Marxism or liberalism, they quote theorists. They quote J.S. Mill or Marx or Germaine Greer or whatever. But when it comes to fascism, nobody was quoting fascists like Mussolini on it. Why? Because the consensus was fascism had no genuine ideas. It was all totalitarian ideology. It was essentially destructive. It was like a tornado of nihilism, destructiveness, and death. And it was backward looking. It was anti-modern. It wanted to take European civilization back to the Stone Age. And actually, when you read fascists, they were saying, modern society is decadent. The nation is falling apart. We need a new era. We want to go forward, and we're going to take the best of the past, of our golden age, of the best qualities of our nation, and we're going to create a new modernity, but not a modernity based on democracy, but a modernity based on this extraordinary essence of the nation and the race, which will make it great again. Now, before anybody takes that phrase out of context, I don't believe that Trump is a fascist, because he's doing it within the democratic system. But these fascists had a belief system. But to show the state of the historical misunderstanding or non-understanding of fascism, when I entered fascist studies, I just started, again, never do this if you're in a position of power. I went to a classic Oxford thing called a little cocktail party or drinks party, where you mix with bigwigs. And one of these bigwigs, I just started my doctorate, was a guy called Dennis Mack Smith, who's a very eminent Italian historian. You can look him up, Dennis Mack Smith. And he said, Roger Griffin, I'd been to Oriel College, and he said, you work? And I said, yeah, I'm working on fascism. He said, why are you bothering about fascism? I mean, fascism's dead. I mean,
it's over.
Do something.
It's over.
It's over. Yes, there's probably some fanatics, National Front, etc., but it's not a significant historical factor. Anyway, what's your approach? I said, well, I'm working on fascist ideology. He said, but fascism has no ideology, my dear boy. My dear boy, I love the my dear boy. Have another glass of sherry. And I thought, wow, what a put down. He was able to write entire books about Italian fascism with no reference whatsoever to the coherence of its underlying vision, or the core of fascist vision that brought together all these very, very different fascists, technocrats, politicians, members of the church, etc., clustered around this central thing that I had recognized, which for him didn't exist. And so, in a way, that meeting with him, it didn't crush me, but I thought, oh dear, there really is a sort of vacuum here to fill.
The conversation with Roger Griffin continues, but you never have to listen to ads again. Support the important work we're doing here. Tap subscribe now in the show notes, or go to historyasithappens.com. So, Roger, this brings us to what you identified as making fascism distinct from other right-wing, ultranationalist, populist ideologies, something that I learned from you. I think our first conversation, I offered you my definition of fascism, and you gave me a B because I was missing something. Yeah. I was aware of it, but not what you had called it. Palingenesis. How did you figure out palingenesis? Well, first, tell us what it is. And then how did you figure out this being so important to understanding fascism?
Well, and this is where literature studies comes in. When you study something like Romanticism, now Romanticism isn't limited to Germany or France and Italy. And in fact, Italian Romanticism is different from French Romanticism, from English Romanticism. So you get used to, your mind is trained to see a general pattern with dialects, and even within the same country, there are very big differences between Wordsworth or William Blake or Shelley or whatever. And so in a way, one good thing came out of my Oxford education was A, I'd read a lot, and B, I was used to pattern recognition, which didn't mean literal duplication, but permutations, more like a family of different related ideas. So when I was reading all these different fascists, there was huge differences between Codreanu in Romania or Primo de Rivera in Spain. I mean, for a start, one was Spanish, one was Romanian. If you want to have a fascist revolution, it's going to be very much dictated by the country you're in. However, when they started talking about what was wrong with the present, there suddenly seemed to be this extraordinary pattern of this twin theme, and I could give it to you in different languages, but decadence, verfallen, the idea of falling or falling apart or falling to pieces, or I'll give you one little bit of trivia about Trump. When he calls traditional Washington politics the swamp, that is literally the same term that the Nazis used about Weimar, der Sumpf. It means the swamp. This language of draining swamps, one of the key concepts in Italian fascism was bonificare. Bonifico means draining a swamp. It's a metaphor for making good, bonificare. So make good a swamp, you drain it and you build on it. So the fascists in Italy loved building on drained swamps. They're famous for it. They said they were getting rid of malaria, etc. Now, Germany didn't drain swamps, but the idea of clearing out, of making good, etc. So I saw this pattern, and I got really excited. Being a nerd, I found this incredibly exciting, and I probably bored people to death.
Buonificare, buonificare.
If you ever make a bank transfer in Italy now, they call it bonifico, which means making good a debt. I saw this pattern, but I had a language problem because I wanted an adjective which went with ultranationalism. This was a form of extreme nationalism, but there have been loads of nationalisms throughout history. Right back to the Middle Ages, you could even think that the Romanness had a sort of nationalistic element. I needed an adjective to go with ultranationalism, and it had to imply some sort of rebirth, but there wasn't an adjective from rebirth or renewal, renewing ultranationalism, rebirthing. Well, rebirthing is a Californian psychotherapy where you get psychologically reborn. And I was sort of vaguely looking for an adjective. And I just by chance, I came across this little book by a guy called Ballanche in French post-revolutionary history. And his name of his book was La Palingénésie Sociale, the rebirth of society. And I read around a bit, and there we were in Italian, palingenetico, in Spanish, palingenetico. And I looked it up. In English, it was used about Christ and the rebirth of Christ, and it was used about fingernails regrowing in obsolete biological terminology, but it was never, ever used in British academic English, meaning rebirth as an adjective. And I had it. I had this sort of, I wish I'd patented it and got a penny for a dime for every time it was used, because it's now a standard word in Anglophone languages. But palingenetic, meaning palin, anew, and genesis, born, it just was so neat. Most intellectuals like a little bit of jargon. So I'd found my own jargon, palingenetic ultranationalism. It's sort of slightly cryptic, slightly open. I found myself able to define fascism in a sentence.
And that helps us understand how fascism is at the same time looking back to look forward, a modernizing renewal, rebirth, almost at an anthropological level of society.
Absolutely. And the beauty is when you see that pattern, is you then look at a nation and you think, well, what are you bringing about again? You have to find in your national history a glorious bit. Now, if you go to Holland, there was the golden age of painting and navy and everything and Rembrandt, etc. That's easy. It's called the golden age. Spain had a golden age. Britain had an Elizabethan age. Now America's got a problem. You haven't been around a lot.
And MAGA is nebulous. He doesn't identify.
Well, you can have nostalgia, and Trump uses this constant. Well, look at him going to compare himself to faces of presidential statues, etc. I mean, you can always look back, but to find a genuine golden age in America is difficult. So then the default mechanism of fascists is to go back to some mythic racial point. Now, the Germans were only a nation in 1871. And you could talk about the architecture or Bach or whatever, but very interestingly, by default, if you can't dig up a golden age in your history, you go racial myth. You dig deeper and you go back to some mythical racial point. And you could do that as Hungarians, and you could say we're all from the Kyrgyz steppes or something. So I found my pattern and I'd found my bit of jargon, and I suddenly, in this manic and very nerdy way, I got a real high out of looking at all these in my doctorate and in my first book, surveying all this chaos out there, explaining why there was chaos, because they were all looking for an essence, and there are no essences in definitions in the human sciences. All you can have is an effective, heuristically effective definition. You can't have a true definition. My definition of fascism isn't true, but it's proved, thanks to the work of lots of other people, really useful for sorting out the fascist goats from the pathological or democratic sheep.
And fascism in the real world, or as practiced, is vicious. It's destructive. There's really
all revolutions are, you know.
Positive fascist experience. Well, maybe for the people who are in the in-group, at least for a little while. So you had your Italian in-laws, their real-life experiences of life under fascism, that colored your engagement with the subject.
Well, yeah. I mean, in a way, I suppose I was on a sort of magic carpet by now. I had this wonderful Italian wife. I was learning Italian. When we were going home, we were going to this little village outside Genoa, where I'm sitting at this moment. Not only had my father been in the war, I could sit on the terrace and try out my theory about how it felt to be fascist and what they were being told about what they were fighting for. And it was, of course, the Romans, the Italians, again, had only been united in the late 19th century. They'd never been a nation, so you couldn't have a golden age of the Italian nation, but you had your Vatican, you had the church, but you had the Roman era.
Yes, Mussolini was obsessed with that. Yeah, go ahead.
He was never a fascist in belief system. He was very Catholic, and true Catholics never quite bought fascism, even though there was a lot of collusion. But he could recognize in what I was saying. He said, yeah, that makes sense. He could see, he could remember the frenzy of the crowds in the streets and the way they were being encouraged to feel that they were experiencing rebirth. And the time when you can go back to that energy is in the beginning of the French Revolution. If you look at how people experienced the early days of the French Revolution, the experience of revolution, fascism as a revolution. Of course, that's maybe completely ignored or hated by Marxist theories of fascism, because that is anathema. There is only one true revolution. This was all manipulation, etc. But I seriously believe that for some of the crowds worshipping Hitler and some of the people in the squares worshipping Mussolini, they really had a powerful subjective sense that their nation was being reborn into this extraordinary golden age. And even though Trumpism isn't fascist, if you study his early rallies, you can get some little hint of what a palingenetic fervor can be like, even though he's done it in a very trashy, watered down way.
Yeah, it's tacky.
But my mother-in-law, who was what's called a little fascist, a piccola italiana, a little Italian, she was in the female youth bit when she was really, really young, and she liked the hoops and the uniform. But in this village where I'm sitting now, not more than 200 meters away from where I'm sitting, there was a strage, there was a massacre, a reprisal massacre of a whole load of local inhabitants of Campomorone. In fact, the street where my wife grew up was called the Street of Martyrs, because that's where they were killed. They were machine gunned outside the local convent because partisans who were in the hills above where I'm sitting had killed some Nazis. And so I started getting, and a village just above us, about 2 miles away, was completely wiped out. So I suddenly started getting this real sense that the destructiveness of Nazism and fascism, and in Italian it's called Nazi fascism because of the collusion between the two, this was motivated by an almost religious fervor about protecting the world from the evils of communism and liberalism and all this decadent stuff. And in a way, yes, a wonderful symbiosis took place between my private life, my teaching life, because I could invent courses on this and teach it, and my publishing life. And really what you see, if you see an official account of my life, these are just the external. I mean, so lucky. I mean, I've lived a long time as well. I've written a lot, but I kept on being asked to write things on.
Let's talk about that, because over the decades, and I'm in this group, people consult you to do interviews. They cite your work. You're a very heavily cited scholar. You're invited to conferences, but often people find what you have to say maybe, well, disappointing if they're looking for someone to confirm, yes, Trump is a fascist. Yes, Orban is a fascist. Yes, Modi is a fascist. You have a different way of explaining these modern phenomena, this populism that we discussed earlier.
Well, I mean,
but you apply your knowledge of fascism to these movements.
Yeah, but I mean, in a way, I'd like to qualify what I'm about to say, because actually, I think the word fascism has got such powerful cathartic value to actually distance yourself from somebody you find repulsive ideologically or almost physically, that actually I'm not going to say you're wrong to call Trump a fascist. I utterly understand that on one level, on an emotive level, he's a fascist, and to call him an illiberalizing Democrat or something,
right-wing populist doesn't really, it doesn't resonate.
No, I mean, so I would say if you're going to use the word fascist about politicians you hate on the right, then do so in the knowledge that you are using the term not as a piece of forensic political jargon, but you're using it in order to emotionally distance yourself from and express your disgust and sense of injustice about somebody. And there I'm totally with people. If you want to call ICE an American equivalent to the fascist Gestapo, that's absolutely fine, but it's absolutely unhistorical. I mean, the Gestapo was infinitely more horrific than ICE, and Hitler and what he had done in his empire was infinitely worse than anything that Trump has done. So let's have a sense of, but if you want to find a forensically accurate term to communicate the nuances of what Trump is, the word fascism really doesn't cut it. And it doesn't cut it precisely because the subtlety of this new attack on freedom and democracy does not come from fascists. It comes from Democrats who want elections and they want freedom of speech for themselves. And they are trying to get rid of what they consider to be the corruption of their democracy by international institutions like the EU or the United Nations, or food relief or health relief for people in the third world, or just being liberal. Trump withdrew from the fascist movement, and I believe he went back into the fold. He's within the system, whereas everything points to the fact that Hitler and Mussolini from this outset only wanted democratic power in order to destroy, much more like Putin. Putin is much closer in that sense to fascism than populist.
Well, fascism is revolutionary, isn't it?
It's revolutionary. But B, I'm going to chuck in another thing, that populism is worse than fascism. Modern contemporary fascism is really, in terms of its material impact on modern society, is absolutely marginalized. Whereas what has populism done? Populism, if you put together Bolsonaro, Netanyahu, Modi, and all these things, they have cut off food aid and health aid to millions of people. They've committed war crimes in the Middle East. They've attacked academic freedom in universities. They've allowed large chunks of the rainforest to be cut down in the name of commercialism and climate denial. I mean, if you put together collectively all the things that have been done in the last 20 years in the name of the people and populism, then actually right-wing populism, whether extreme or moderate, is actually posing a political danger domestically, a huge problem internationally in terms of solidarity with a nation like Ukraine or whatever. And in the support populism has given to what I consider to be an absolute anathema of what's going on in Gaza and in the Middle East. And finally, catastrophic impact on the chances of human being to face the climate polycrisis. And so I think, even though populism sounds somehow less bad than fascism, oh, don't worry about it, he's not fascist, he's just a populist. No, populism now is the main destructive force in the world outside autocracies. And so I take it extremely seriously. And I understand why people keep reverting to the word fascism, because it's much closer to the destructive truth of populism. But we must distinguish fascism from what's actually going on, which is much closer to what you might think of as an autoimmune disease. It's something actually happening within our body politic, whereas Nazism and fascism was like a virus attacking liberal democracies from outside. And in a way, the autoimmune metaphor makes it much more scary because it's your own body attacking itself, whereas Nazism and Hitler really was much more like an alien force attacking what was already there. Look at the destruction of Weimar and look at Trump's destruction of American liberal democracy, and they are both horrific, but they're both the rationales and the visions driving them are different.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to talk about democracy and Moby Dick. Yes, a white whale, I say. As we report history as it happens, make sure to sign up for my free newsletter. Just go to Substack and search for History as It Happens.